Hello, and welcome to Pride and Prejudice and Podcasts. This is a special micro-podcast put on by myself, Nat Almorel.
Oh, I gotta introduce myself, do I? You're not gonna key me up? And Kurt Halfyard.
And Laura Jane Halfyard.
And we'll be focusing on the BBC 1995 miniseries Pride and Prejudice, based on the novel Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, which Wikipedia usefully informs me is first published in 1813. And in general, it follows the prides and prejudices of the Bennet family, along with a number of wealthy families during the Regency period of England, which any fans of Blackadder recall is during the reign of George IV and George III. And Kurt is a little bit more versed in the other adaptations of this. Obviously, this is not the first time this work has been adapted for, film or television, for that matter. And why don't you take it away, Kurt?
Before I get into that, I should mention that Laura Jane reads the book fairly often. I'm in the process of reading the book for the first time, and I'm not sure how much of an Austen fan you are, Nat, in terms of are you a regular visitor to the novel, or do you...
I've read it before, but I read it in college, so this would be about 10 years ago. My area of focus for my undergraduate degree was English literature, and it was kind of around this period. So I did read this, Sense and Sensibility, also read Persuasion, but I think Persuasion is one I recall the most, and I know there's a couple other Austen works out there, Emma, and I think Northanger Abbey, but I have not gotten around to them yet. So a little bit familiar, but I'm a long ways out from having read them.
And have you read the book more times than you've watched the miniseries that we're talking about?
Yes.
You read it often.
I do, and not even just that version, but the other versions as well.
Oh yes, the hot Pride and Prejudice.
It's not
the zombie Pride and Prejudice.
I haven't read that one.
There's certainly there's no shortage of the printed word on this book, but it's been adapted many times. But I think I speak for all of us when I say that the 1995 one, at least for our generation, feels like the definitive one. I know some people like the Joe Wright, Keira Knightley starring one, but I must admit, when I visualize,
intro, but it's not anywhere near as well covering of the book as this BBC version is.
Okay, so if you go back to 1940, there is a Maureen O'Sullivan, Laurence Olivier version that was made. Then it was made again in 1967 for British television, and curiously, in that version, the actress who plays Jane is the mother of Suzanne Harker, who plays Jane in the 1995 one. And I'm sure we were talking when we were watching the first part about the casting of Jane and the casting of Charlotte. I'm sure will come up again. Then it was adapted in 1995, again as a television miniseries, and it was made again in 2006 as the Joe Wright film, and also in 2001 Bridget Jones's Diary came out, which isn't an exact adaptation, but since it stars Colin Firth, was written by Andrew Davies, who wrote the 1995 version, and the author Helen Fielding also cited the 1995 miniseries as her inspiration to write Bridget Jones' Diary. So there's a lot of connection in through there. And then it was adapted one more time in 2016 with zombies. Which I've not seen, but I know you and our daughter watched.
No, we went, but it was.
But I think in terms of accuracy and to the text, I think the 1995 one is pretty close.
The 6 series, the 6 sessions, is obviously much longer than the an hour and a half movie would be. So.
Well, I think it's the kind of material that does lend itself pretty well to specifically a television adaptation. You're right in the cusp of that time where you have serialized novels And I don't think Pride and Prejudice was right quite there, but something like Dickens, which would be a couple years later, would be perfect for that because, of course, they're written in installments and they're written to have cliffhangers. So you would buy the next issue. And again, I think this was published as a full novel, but
it is broken into 3 parts.
What's that?
It is broken into 3 parts, the novel, but not published in any way. They're natural structural breaks, which I'm guessing the miniseries adheres pretty closely to. The first 2 parts are part 1 of the novel, and then the second 2 parts are part 2, and so forth.
Yeah, I don't remember that.
And I think if the Brits do one thing in television well, it's adaptations of classical British novels or British literature in general. And I think, again, I really haven't seen too many of the other adaptations, but at least other adaptations of Austen's work or other works of literature or novels around this time. I think something that really, really makes this series stand out and in terms of quality and really memorableness, is, of course, the actors. I think one of the things I noticed on this watch, and I've seen the miniseries a couple of times. I watched it first in college on glorious VHS and then picked up the DVD set about 10 years ago or so. But I was surprised, 1, how fast it went by, but 2, how every actor seems to be doing double duty, where every expression on their face is conveying more, at least one emotion, but oftentimes 2, 3 or so, and concealing some feelings, stating something on the surface which is flagrantly not true, and trying to uphold some conventional norms, which of course is a cornerstone of British literature, and especially during this time, it's something I really love.
Well, what I noticed rewatching the miniseries, and I think we're pretty similar to you in that we started with it on VHS, and then many years ago I replaced my VHS tapes with.
No, it was the first introduction that you bought it for me for DVD, and remember we sat down one evening to watch it, and we were just going to watch 1 episode, and then we're just maybe 2, but we ended up going till 2 a.m. watching all of it.
Binge watching before the phrase existed. It is actually a very nice binge watch. Like, if you do really have the 6 hours and you want to do it all at once. The thing I noticed on this particular viewing is, from a filmmaking point of view, what you're saying, where the actors have multiple expressions, but the director constantly gives you reaction shots. This might as well be called Reaction Shot, the miniseries, because someone will say something, it'll quickly flash to different actors. They all kind of react, which is, again, in the novel, when you're reading it, it always, Lizzie is always looking to see what other people are doing. So the directing of the series is kind of from that point of view as well.
But I think everyone else in the room at this time, at this era, was probably watching for the reaction as well, or just to see what other people were thinking, right? Hence the Pride stuff, hence the Prejudice stuff, right? Where people are always watching what other people were doing. Yeah,
and the one thing I did really notice in this is that the directing of this miniseries, a lot of times television is just get it done, very workmanlike, very basic direction. But the direction in this particular miniseries feels very pointed in what you were just saying, but also in framing. There's a few scenes that we can talk about in both episodes when we get going on this, of where it's like, wow, that's not just simple shoot it and get it done television. That's actually cinematic kind of direction.
And I think, again, as a television series, and with the reactions being so important or so crucial to so many of the plot elements and just the general theme or tone of the story itself, it does help because you can save a little bit on production costs, because I imagine shooting in some of those locations can get a little bit expensive. But when you really just focus a lot on the actors and take full advantage of their range, at least in physical acting, it certainly is a big help.
Yeah, it doesn't look like in any way this series skimped, though.
That's true.
If you go back, because the series just celebrated its 20th anniversary last year. So there was a lot of sort of people talking about it. Obviously, Jennifer L. and Colin Firth are both big stars now. And so there was a lot of reminiscing and what they were doing, because a lot of them were very young at the time, and they went off to other work. And nobody really expected, the mid-90s was not this is like when the Spice Girls were kind of the thing in Britain. No one was really ready for, or thought, a period piece, which is, like you said, it's a staple of British TV, but no one expected it to kind of shut Britain down from a TV point of view for the airing of the series. Like, this thing was a monster when it played. I can't speak to how it played on this side of the pond in the mid-90s. I certainly didn't encounter it till VHS or later. I didn't watch it. If it was aired concurrently or in some, exported version on television, I was in the middle of university, so I wasn't watching any TV at the time.
Yeah, I don't really know too much about like what the huge, outside of I guess, the cultural impact that we see of other films and television shows being influenced by it later. But yeah, in terms of how much of a cultural icon it was just in Britain itself, I can't really speak to. But it does make me curious, though, like, who was the producer who said what the world needs now is an adaptation of Pride and Prejudice? Do we need this period drama? We need to bring Jane Austen back. And is there, like, some cultural moment or something like that really is representing of that, or that's commenting on, or is it just a really great adaptation? And to my knowledge, it's just a really, really great adaptation. But I still wonder, what was it that really led to its creation?
I think it's that Jane Austen in general, and specifically Pride and Prejudice as the list of adaptations, and this doesn't even include all sorts of other sideball thing. Yeah, there's lots of. It's just this just constantly drifts around in British culture. So I just imagine it that was the cycle, but the stars aligned particularly well for that adaptation. I mean, Andrew Davies was just coming off of House of Cards, the British political drama that, I mean, many years later was adapted with Kevin Spacey for Netflix. So he was quite successful then, and then they jumped right into this version. So I guess things just came together. So nobody knows why it hit, but I think it's pretty clear. You get two actors that clearly have great chemistry together. And if you look at Colin Firth's career post Pride and Prejudice miniseries, it's hard not to think of him, no matter what he's doing, as Mr. Darcy. And he is, I don't know if lamented is the right word, but he's come out and said, it doesn't matter what I do, that's what people call me in the UK. Like, it became one of these television cultural moments, and that's why we're talking about it right now, to be honest. I mean, that I can't think of any of the other versions that, when I read the book, which I'm doing right now, and certainly will be done by the time we're done this podcast, that's who I picture. I can't displace those images.
Yeah, but do you do that for every book that you
It happens, yeah, it happens. Right? But I certainly don't see Keira Knightley. I certainly don't see Donald Sutherland as my favorite character in the whole series as the dad. I don't picture him. I always picture Benjamin Whitrow, the very fine actor who plays the father, and even the kind of over the top Mrs. Bennett, Alison Steadman's performance. I mean, it's pretty dialed up to 11, but that, I think, is that's very charming to me. I like that.
Well, since we're discussing the characters, should we jump into discussion about episode 1, since I think it is kind of the getting to know the characters episode?
Absolutely. I mean, the series it doesn't open with Elizabeth, which is kind of curious. It actually opens with Darcy and Wickham on horseback.
Not Wickham.
Bingley.
Oh, sorry, Bingley, thank you. Surveying real estate, right? Like, they're going to buy, what is it? Yeah. Netherfield. So...
and I'm going to say that right off at the beginning, even though there's certain scenes that they've put into the series that aren't there in the book, like that scene is not there in the book. Or even if they they take some of the conversation but put it in a different format, as in this case, them riding the horses across the field. I never feel that they're overstepping the bounds of the book or that they're adding stuff in. It always feels to me like they're enlightening some aspect of the story when they make these new scenes.
I think there's a pragmatic reason too for sort of focusing a little bit more on the men than the novel does, is that it creates a more joint audience. I mean, it's very famous that women will often watch some movie that their guy is watching or whatever, and guys are somewhat reluctant to be as equal with watching that. So I think that there's a conscious choice, but nevertheless, that's how it opens. But then it goes to the sort of iconic theme, I guess, music of the show, and it has Elizabeth Bennet just walking, because I feel it's pretty implicit in the story that she gathers her thoughts while walking around, so you get kind of a view of the countryside and an introduction to Jennifer L. and just her body language, because she's not interacting with anyone, but she does, as you said, to introduce the show, she wanders to her father or their estate. I've always forget the names of the estates, so you can fill it in. What's their Longbourn?
Longbourn,
yeah. So they into Longbourn, and then there's your rogues gallery of Bennets. You get a quick introduction to, I think, everybody. Do you get Mary as well? She seems to be always the one that gets left out.
So it's at the church, which is the first conversation you see with the five sisters and the parents.
And I think they do such a great job of immediately telling you what everyone in the Bennett family's relation is to everyone else. Like with the first shot, you see Elizabeth going by the window, and she looks at her father, and her father just kind of does the rolling of his eyes, and you immediately understand, okay, so she's closer to her father than her mother, or at least like they have this bond. And then just her interactions or her body language with Jane is immediately telling you, okay, these are, they're the two closest, and then Kitty and Lydia are just kind of running around in their own little world, and poor Molly, who the entire family has already given up on, and Mrs. Bennet is just kind of this, I guess, off in her own little world, but just in such a short amount of time, you immediately know all the groundwork, and you kind of fill in all the backstory of the family. Which I don't think is a very easy task, and something that's done very, very well.
And often the case when they make these adaptations, I'm guessing that they believe their audience, the bulk of their audience, is familiar either with other versions of the story or directly to the source material. So it's kind of a nice thing that because if this were made in 2016, they would probably skip that sort of thing and say, okay, let's just jump right in or whatever. If it does almost play like a very sophisticated opening of a 1980s sitcom. Everybody kind of glances up as the camera comes by you. If you had freeze frames and whatever, it would kind of be like that. Now I want to stop right there and talk about the DVD that we're watching, which is the A&E special edition from a number of years ago. But I'm not sure how other versions do the intro to each part, because our version just starts, no nothing, and then at the end of every episode it freeze frames and then just jumps into the next one. No opening credits, no nothing. I'm not sure what other versions and how they did it when it originally aired.
I'm not sure either. I picked up my copy on Amazon Streaming, and they do play the title music for each episode. I think just a general title sequence, and they'll have, I think, the shots from like the first episode or whatever. I don't know. I haven't really paid too much attention to the opening credits, and then the closing credits, we just kind of skip to the next episode.
Because they're doing Stitch during the music as the credits come up.
Yes. Yep. Yeah.
Okay. So that we don't get. We get it at the first one, but it's a weird choice from a home media version, because there's clearly the freeze frame to demarcate the end of the episode, but then it just boom, right into it. Other than the disc change, because it's across 2 discs. It's also nicely widescreen, which I guess it was shot on film, so they took the original elements rather than, I assume, when people were watching this on British television, it was cropped, and that's a shame because, and it's a benefit to us watching it 20 years later. The way they place people in the frame is pretty sophisticated, and cropping that down, I think you would lose some of the filmmaking, and so in a way, there's a benefit to watching it now with widescreen elements rather than the actual original airing, which is unusual, I think.
Well, and I think too, whenever they're outside, they always give a very wide breadth for any estate that they're looking at, and just re-emphasizing, I guess, like there are people who are of decent means and people who are ridiculously wealthy and people who are fabulously wealthy, and it's a fun game trying to figure out, okay, well, how many pounds a year does Bingham make in income, and then how many more does Darcy make in income, and how many more does Lady Catherine de Bourgh make than any of them?
That's my favorite Jane Austen drinking game, is when someone quotes their annual salary. Like
Jane Austen drinking game.
It's in all of her. Like, if I'm more familiar with the film and television, but Mansfield Park, it comes up constantly. And in the first episode, because they're like you said, they're trying to establish everything. Mrs. Bennet is like very excited of how many pounds Bingley makes, and even more excited that Darcy makes, I think she says double that or twice that. I
just love the idea of like the village gossip and Mrs. Bennet having like some ledger where she just puts down every potential or prospect husband for her daughters, like, oh, well, this is his income, but then these are his holdings, and even if he doesn't bring in this much, he could bring in that much when this relative dies. And just imagining every middle-class mother in early 19th century England having a book like that.
And it's established reasonably clear that the Bennets are not they're wealthy enough to have servants, but they're not of means. I'm not sure if they bring it up in the first episode. I think they might, though, that the daughters do not stand to inherit.
Yes,
Longbourn.
The conversation with Elizabeth and Jane in their bedroom.
In the bedroom,
In the bedroom, yeah.
And I think that's something you can kind of pick up just from Mrs. Bennet's reaction, too. I mean, obviously, not all the mothers are as big of busybodies, I guess might be the word, but just how fervently she talks about her marrying her daughters off, and yes, there is the idea that once a woman reaches 25 or so, she becomes an old maid, but of the other mothers, I don't think you really see any of them as committed to marrying her daughters off or marrying them to wealthy gentlemen. So I think even though they explicitly outright state it, I think it is kind of implied here and there.
And I think the whole series is designed to mock poor Mrs. Bennet. I mean, the show is already laughing at her, like the pregnant looks between Elizabeth and her father. I mean, her father, almost every zinger, and he's wall to wall. Everything Mr. Bennet says is pretty much gold. But all of it seems to be tearing down Mrs. Bennet's desire to see her daughters set. Like, I think that the father's like, they'll be fine. Like, they don't need this extra wealth or whatnot. I don't get the sense that the father...
I don't know.
So. I don't think it's a case that they don't necessarily need that. I just think that, hey, she's going to be doing this anyway. I might just well get some entertainment in it. Well, I just think he likes to poke fun of her.
And, what else is his mother going to do? She's already had quite a spell of having kids. But I have a little bit more sympathy for Mrs. Bennet because I think they do show later on in the series, here are some of the consequences of having a scandal, or here are some of the consequences of not marrying someone of means or being poverty struck, and some of the dangers of that, and how life can really just completely put you in the gutter very, very quickly if like one word is misplaced. I mean, that's the brilliance and the greatest part, for me at least, of this kind of era of literature where everything that someone says, obviously I haven't learned anything from it, but everything that someone says has such dire consequences. And so you have to really be constantly double talking the entire time. I mean, the British, it was a Brit who came up with the idea of double talk.
Well, but everybody does that except for Jane, who's the nicest of the daughters. But Mrs. Bennet doesn't. Mrs. Bennet is so transparent in her schemes to do things, particularly when she's in society. I feel the show, the way it's shot, Alison Steadman's performance, it's all there to show just how coarse Mrs. Bennet is in better society, with thrusting her daughters upon the Bingleys. And like the first episode has at least one social gathering in it. Is it the Longbourn or the whatever lodge? Like the first social where Bingley and Darcy show up. Everybody is there, both of Bingley's sisters.
I don't know where it is.
Her husband. It's in town. Yeah. And that's the first kind of meeting in society between all of the kind of principal characters. And it's very clear, particularly with the two Bingley sisters, but with a lot of people, are like how over the top Mrs. Bennet is. And she's not quiet. Like, it's a pretty small space of gathering. And she, like, when Darcy snubs, like he won't dance and whatever, she is speaking, and it is very clear from the way the camera is moving around that people can absolutely hear what she's saying, and she's almost saying it so that they can hear. I don't feel she has the duplicity that, or sort of social, say one thing, mean another, be polite, don't, the doublespeak that you say. I don't think she has it, and I think she's punished all throughout the series for basically, let's face it, Miss Bennet is like dumb. If Miss Bennet were 15, she would be Lydia, the crazy young daughter, like the just flirting over the soldiers, not really a care in the world. But now that she's got all these daughters, her only mission in life is to marry them off to wealth. She doesn't even care if they're properly matched in love. I think that's kind of the charm, is that she doesn't make very good choices or good matches for her daughters. It's just whatever one will pair off with whatever, right?
But even when she is talking about Darcy, it's a different way of when she's talking to Mr. Bennet or any of her daughters, because she is pretty explicit and direct when she's talking to her family. But in the case of when she's dressing down Darcy, she's with her circle of friends and she's making passive-aggressive offhand comments like, oh, well, that Mr. Darcy, apparently he doesn't like to dance, or he said he's not much of a dancer. Well, every man I've ever known who's a real man is a dancer, or something like that. It's at least she has, she may not have the most tact, and certainly compared to a lot of other members of her family and her society, not nearly as much. But there is still a different way that she carries herself in public company, even if it's more overt than everyone else. I think there's still a little bit of reserved and some degree of tact there. It
does seem to decrease, though, as the more comfortable she gets with Bingley and more comfortable in her negative opinion of Darcy, too. We see that during the first two shows.
I think her most subtle scheme, and the one thing that almost feels too clever by far for her, from what we've seen of her, is the scheme to get Jane to go over to Netherfield for dinner, but instead of taking the father's stage,
she takes the horse,
so because it's raining and she'll get stuck over there. And then when Jane gets sick and has to stay, you really get the sense that Miss Bennet's like, bonus? They get to look after her? Like she gets more time to, dig her claws into Mr. Bingley, which isn't Jane's way, which is a fundamental kind of misunderstanding. She's just pushing, but I feel that scheme is kind of clever, like to say, no, go over this way. It's like leaving an umbrella or leaving a hat so you can come back and do that. But fascinating. If I can go
Seinfeld.
back to anyone who's listened to our other micro podcast, we did I Claudius first, and I Claudius has a matron at the center, Livia, who is this, and everyone's murdering and poisoning, and it's much, certainly I Claudius is much more bloody than Pride and Prejudice, but it's kind of interesting to see how Miss Bennet is the light version of Livia's. Like she's got schemes, and her family has to rise with her schemes, and she will do whatever. Doesn't matter whether it's subtle or not. She will do whatever to push her daughters on. But in the case of Jane, it kind of sort of is working. I don't know if it's Miss Bennet's schemes that are working, but Jane and Bingley do have a real connection.
Yeah, but I guess she's putting her daughters in a situation where there's a better chance that she's going to end up spending more time with Bingley, right? So, yes, taking the horse so that you get rained on, so that you'll have to spend the night. Okay, so that means there's more likely that she's going to meet with Bingley.
And what I like about that scene is that it's also an opportunity for Elizabeth to go over there. So we've spent some time with the Bennets. We've spent some time in society with the Bennets. Now we get to take the daughters and push them into the upper, like their betters, so to speak. So you have Elizabeth, who doesn't take the stage and doesn't take the horse. She does what Elizabeth does. She walks over, so through the mud, and stomps over and just shows up. There's a lovely conversation with her mother, because her mother's like, you won't look properly when you arrive. You won't be presentable. And Elizabeth, being very practical minded and not taking her mother's shit more than any of the daughters, she decides, I don't care what I look like. I'm going over there to be with my sister. Like in fact, if I look unpresentable, even better, because it would just get in the way of my real purpose going over there. And then when they do get over there, you get some time with Elizabeth and Jane, but really you get time with Elizabeth and all the Bingleys. And Mr. Darcy is there as well, right? So, but really I think this scene early on, Darcy is introduced in the first episode, and there's lots of information that Colin Firth, but I really think for me, it's watching Elizabeth interact with all these other social situations and watching how she handles the Bingley sisters, and just that interplay is very interesting. And I think Mr. Darcy's kind of defending her a little bit, because the older Bingley sister, Caroline, she's the one who's kind of almost
cattier.
She's always out there to, like, they giggle when Miss Bennet speaks. She always gets in there and has to assert their society and their money and their taste over the...
My turn. Sorry. So back to the whole comment about now you get to see Elizabeth as she's walking, being practical, and just wants to go see her sister. I think that scene, or that whole if she didn't have that bad taste in her mouth from the first comment of being rejected by Darcy, I wonder if she would have played the game a little bit more, as in, okay, I'll try not to be dirty. Okay, I'll just walk over to still want to check on my sister, but maybe, a percentage of her time would be, okay, I'd like to look good too as well, in case something would happen between her and Darcy or someone else. But I think because she's decided, or earlier on it was set that, okay, there's some animosity between the two, that she takes more of a, well, whatever, I'm just going to see my sister.
She sees that her family was somewhat made a little bit of a scene at the lodge social.
Well, not even that her family did. The fact that Darcy just
snubbed her and
basically
insulted her looks and like the full package, really, in the initial thing. So she's like, well, screw them. I'm just going to go over whatever, and I'm just going to be
And
me.
I think that gave a little more freedom for her to be her, still polite, but be her when she was in that house, because then she's like, well, I'm not trying to please anybody here. I'm just here for me and my sister, right?
But it totally works, because if you look at all the Colin Firth reaction shots, the more real Elizabeth is, and just is a human being and not doing that. She's not embarrassing herself. She's just not staying within the rigid. There's this lovely scene. I think it might be in the second episode, but where Mr. Darcy's looking out a window and
it's the first.
Jane is playing like with the dog out there, or Elizabeth is playing with the dog, and he just sees like, look, there's a person just enjoying themselves, and she doesn't care about her petticoats or anything else, and there's a really good Colin Firth reaction.
But I think he is not used to someone not playing the game, let's say, because there's Mrs. Bennet wasn't the only mother out there trying to get their daughters married. Yeah. So they were probably, he's used to people being thrown in his general direction, right? So.
Do you think it's a marry me for my money or marry me for my personality thing going on?
Well, I mean, you see the conversation throughout, where basically the goal of the mother is to get their daughters married. Pretty unabashed. Right? So, maybe he was actually coming to the country to get away from a little bit of it, but he's probably being ineligible of $10,000 a year.
Take a drink.
Yeah. Then he's not used to people not scraping and bowing and just saying whatever they can to get in his good books.
Well, I guess maybe that's an advantage of being somebody out in the country, is that you're maybe not expected to have the same social graces that you would have in the city. But Elizabeth kind of she does embody that, but I think she also doesn't quite have that obsequiousness, which some characters certainly do, as we'll get to, I guess. Well,
I think she knows what she wants, and it comes out earlier in her conversation with her sister. It's just, I want to marry for love.
Yeah.
And that's important to her, right? So, and that's when she's kind of realizes I'm probably going to be a spinster, but...
Yeah. And then she has the conversation with Charlotte where she's like, get a little bit in love, and then lock it down.
Yeah.
And then you can do the rest of the falling in love after. Very pragmatic.
And then how
this is her friend.
Elizabeth thinks it's, you would never do that. Oh, really? Let's see that in the next scene.
Yeah.
Actually, talking about Bingley's sisters too, that is Mrs. Bennet at age 20 or so. Like it is that same sort of nastiness, and if she were in a wealthier family, I never
would have said that Mrs. Bennet would have been that mean, maybe, but
she totally would have. If she had the means,
people under the bus.
She's kept honest by her relative poverty. I guarantee you, like every time Miss Bennet gets her way, everything is like fawning and delightful, but every time it's the end of the world. That money isn't going to make that prettier.
Yeah.
You just know it is.
And to be fair to just a moment to Mrs. Bennet, she also is there as kind of an indicator of stakes. Now she exaggerates those to a good degree, but it is a constant reminder of again, there may be consequences to becoming a spinster. Maybe not as dire as she says, but this is the part of society. And
I don't think there's any doubt that Miss Bennet's intentions for her daughter are anything less than good, but the whole road to hell is paved with good intentions. Mary has a line. I think it might be from the book. I know when you read the book, the first couple chapters are pretty. Jane Austen drops a lot of sort of portentous sayings of foreshadowing of what's going to happen, and they use one of them in the movie when Mary says oftentimes misfortune is a blessing, and I think this episode follows that to some extent, in that Darcy insulting Elizabeth allows Elizabeth to be more Elizabeth, what we were speaking with earlier. I don't know if that statement that Mary makes is supposed to be directly connected to that, but I think it applies.
Well, it's also, whenever Mary says something like that, you get the Blazing Saddles sense of Nietzsche says, out of chaos comes order, hope blow it out your ass.
Yeah, there's a lot of poor Mary. Let's all have a moment for poor Mary. She's like
little child.
She's the middle of five, right?
Yeah.
And while Lizzie, also not Lizzie, who's the
Kitty?
So there's Lydia
and Kitty.
Kitty, I feel, also gets short shrift in terms of she's like Lydia Light, but Mary is her own person. But she's such a kind of bookish wallflower type that she doesn't get
Well, she's so alien. I mean, you can pick up parts of each parent in the other four daughters, but you're wondering like what recessive gene
that's a good point.
came through to create poor Mary.
Yeah, well, maybe it's the Collins gene that came over and got them. I know Mr. Collins isn't in this episode yet, but she has
on episode 1?
that bookishness. Other little. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, so I when we were talking about the first scene, I forgot about the whole going through the house stuff. I was referring to the scene with it when they were coming out of the church and Miss Bennet starts talking about Mr. Bingley. And I just thought there was very interesting from there, the introduction of the characters, because the order of how they walk, as in the eldest down to the youngest, and through that conversation walking back to the house, it's Jane and Elizabeth who are talking back to the sister saying, shh, that's not appropriate, or don't talk like that. And it was very interesting to me just to see that it's the Jane and Elizabeth that are doing the discipline of the sisters. And that's introduced in that walking there. The other thing I noticed is Mrs. Bennet, I don't think she ever calls Mr. Bennet anything but Mr. Bennet. And I just thought, you know what, okay, for a couple who's been married over 20 years, they're not using Christian names at all, so...
Again, it comes back to my whole theory that Mr. Bennet married Mrs. Bennet when she was pretty and not realizing that she was as dumb as she was. And then after they were married for a while, he's like, there's not much to work with here. I'll just be in my library.
Yeah.
And she can do her thing. I fully believe, despite all of Mr. Bennet, all of his quips and things, that, yeah, he is managing the family. He's the firm. There's even a scene where he's doing accounting. Okay. I know they're trying to show that, they're not of much means because he sighs after he goes through his accounts. But he's, pardon me?
And then grabs a drink.
Yeah, he grabs a drink. But I get the sense that he was young and inexperienced, and marriage in this era of Britain is forever. So he's just resigned to the fact that they don't. I can't picture, after having their brood of daughters, Mrs. Bennet, and Mr. Bennet having sex. I just can't. It's hard enough.
Well, you saw what they're wearing, but yeah.
It's hard enough. I get that whole scene from A Fish Called Wanda where you have John Cleese, and I can't remember the actress's name, that plays his wife, clipping their toenails, and they have separate beds. Yeah. And then you have Jamie Lee Curtis and Kevin Kline in the most over-the-top, energetic sex. I think Kevin Kline's thrusts are meters. It's so. But the contrast between the two, it's implanted in my head. In general, elderly British folks, they just stop having sex completely, and that's definitely underscored in the body language between Mr. and but then there's also the men are still doing everything in this era, at least in terms of estate and whatnot. So she does just defer.
House, right? But her job is getting her daughters married.
Yeah, that's unquestionably, unquestionably. And I think Mr. Bennet's job is to restrain her with sarcasm, even though that's not a particularly great approach.
Something that I noticed too, but that conversation from the church back into their house, all the daughters know that Mr. Bennet is teasing her, but she doesn't.
I know. Even
know it, or she pretends she doesn't. Sets the stage. Okay, sarcasm all around.
Well, and that's what gets Lizzie to interact so well with Darcy. There is that shared wit, but I think, too, I always feel like Elizabeth is immediately attracted and never really loses that attraction to Darcy from the first episode. And maybe it's just that there is such a great chemistry between the two actors, or if it is just intended. I think to some degree it is, even when both characters try to deny their feelings, or at least Elizabeth tries to deny her feelings. And it's a pretty good contrast, too, where they're trying to hide their emotions in every interaction with each other, certainly in the second episode, I think. And then you have Jane and Bingley, who just hit it off so well and are constantly smiling at each other and in their own little world.
I feel the series does a very good job at saying that, like showing that Bingley and Jane can be happy enough. It's shallow, but it's honest. And then it provides that contrast to show Elizabeth and Darcy as much more complicated, introspective characters. Like I feel, and if it wasn't for years and years and years of rom-com conditioning, and in many ways, Pride and Prejudice is like the first. It probably isn't the first, but to me it feels like the first book or whatever laying down that template of kind of an awkward meet cute. One of them insults the other. They have feelings. Then there's an incident that keeps them apart, and then they defy all the odds or whatever and come back together. I feel that's been the de facto structure, at least in film, of rom-coms. And while Pride and Prejudice will play it out over 6 hours in much more slow motion than, say, Bridget Jones' Diary, the audience is primed, I think, to never really overly feel that the Darcy-Elizabeth relationship is not going to happen. You just enjoy the process of it happening. I'm sure that's the way you feel when you read the books again and again and again. I mean, there's no spoilers here.
Yeah. I've watched it too many times. Your statement that Elizabeth's trying to hide her feelings there. I think she was attracted to Darcy at the first, just at looks. He's good looking. Oh, great, he's got some money. But then I think as soon as she got turned down there, it's just kind of okay, well, that's a no-win, and she just moves on. I don't think that she's harboring any feelings at that point. And because I think even later on, as you read through the rest of the book and see the rest of the series, she's confused and doesn't understand why Darcy's looking at her, or why he's having these conversations. So I don't think she senses that he could be attracted to her, although Charlotte does. I know we're getting to the next series, or the next session now, but...
Well, maybe it's just my reading, but I do get a sense that after he snubs her, she kind of takes it upon herself to do, like, the battle of wits with him.
Oh, battle of wits for sure, yeah.
And antagonize him and fight, the male-female version of a duel, which is a verbal duel, which is always much more preferable.
But
I think in those kind of verbal sparrings that there is kind of like, the initial physical attraction, whether or not that's still there is like that attraction to the mind and to at least like the tongue.
Yes. Yeah, I can see that attraction to the mind there, and then that kind of fun to have a sparring partner.
Well, she does dress Darcy down at the Bingley estate. Not brutally, but it's not so much a dressing down as it is, you said this, I don't entirely agree with your, with what you said, and and so she fights back, and I think that's the chief attraction that Darcy sees, that she's, what's the phrase, one of the Bingley sisters says, a conceited affection for independence. That's the line that the elder Caroline Bingley describes, because that's when she stomped over there in her boots and whatnot. And I think, and Caroline throws that out there as how coarse. And Darcy's like, finally, like that's certainly the sense early. In the book, it does actually shift to Darcy's thoughts a few times, and so explicitly when you're reading it. But in the show, like as I said, everything is done with reaction shots, and there's some meaty Colin Firth, I like this girl reaction shots, where I think she's just, I don't know if I completely agree to say that she's immediately attracted to him. I think she's just doing her thing.
No, but I think it's at the ball, at that assembly, the first assembly, when she sees him, oh, he's good looking. Oh, he's got money. There's a prospect. Shoots her down. All right, moving on to the next one. Like I don't think she, her heart isn't lost over it, but.
No, I kind of think that's what the best part of Elizabeth as a character is. She's compassionate, she's intelligent, but the most important thing I think is that she just seems to have this resilience. Like, okay, there'll be other opportunities, or this can happen, and it's fine. I don't have to swoon and
Well, she's already resigned herself to be an old maid.
I think she's kind of joking,
Yeah.
but it's the type of joke that,
Yeah.
Well, and she's not quite of the age where, she really has to worry that much about it, too. And
right, and that's a bit hampered in the series, I guess, in that the actors are clearly older. This always happens when they do period, right?
See, I didn't get that until you told me how old Lydia, the character Lydia,
they quote ages. They quote ages, and the actors are all like this, is like a high school show. They're always older.
Different. You said so. Lydia.
The actor who plays
15.
Lydia was 25.
She's 25.
15. she looks and is playing young, but I think even Jane, is the oldest daughter, is like 22, and clearly the actor Susanna Harker and Jennifer L are, they're not much older than that, but they are older than that. Maybe that's just a sign of maturity and good breeding. I mean, it's really difficult to say, and I'm not saying that it's a problem at all. It's just one of these. Oh, I read the book and I watched the film or whatever, and you're like, oh, okay, they cast a little older.
Actually,
I didn't even notice till you said it. It's Mrs. Foster who we meet, who looks very young to me.
Oh, she's
Colonel Foster's
married to the guy that's always drinking and passed out on the.
No, that's Hearst. That's Carolyn's younger sister, Louisa.
Right.
Yeah, no, not her. Colonel Foster.
Who's the capital guy?
That's Sir Lucas.
Yeah,
William Lucas.
Sorry, I can't let this episode go by without that guy.
Capital,
He's just.
Oh yeah.
Britain is a wealth of fabulous faces and great character actors, and certainly the Bennets, Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, profit from this. Yeah. But there is a host of, like, right down to who's the young captain, Denny, or whatever. Like, even his face is interesting. Everybody's, and that capital guy is Sir William is. Yeah, he flits around because he's the host of the original Social. But watching him, and I can never tell if he's aware, because people say some pretty mean British things to him, and does he just slough it off? I'm the host, water off a duck's back, or is he honestly oblivious? And his capital is a space filling thing, or is it a brushing it off thing? I don't know.
Well, they do say, I think it's somewhere in the book, that he's taken the mantle of Sir very seriously. So I think he's pompous. He's got I'm not sure so much pompous.
Oh.
I've got some big shoes to fill here as being knighted, and this is how you behave.
Both the Bingley sisters take a piece out of him when he says he has contacts and he can introduce them in court, and they're like, well, whatever, guy, you're in the country. Sorry, I like that, and it goes even further at that party, because you're inside and it's a social, and everyone's not in their finest, because that will be the ball later in episode 2. But this is the initial social. Everyone's putting themselves out there. It's like the first cocktail at the beginning of a conference. Yeah. Everyone's just like meeting or whatever. And you watch this all happening. There's dancing and so forth going on. But then there's this beautiful cut outside, and you see all the footmen and servants hanging out and drinking, and they're like watching what's going on inside. So you think, oh, if the Bennets are like, or even capital are like of low class, they're still like, Britain has many levels, and you watch these guys, and the one guy, he's drinking and he's dancing, and it's a beautiful cut. I just have to stop and mention how nice that cut is. He's drunk, he falls, he splashes in the watering thing for the horses, and it cuts to applause of the first dance being over. That's what, to me, distinguishes. There are so few moments in things like I, Claudius, which was many years before this, and other British TV shows that really have a sense of cinema for their TV. And when I see just a marvelous cut like that, I'm like, wow, that's awesome. And the fact is, you're supposed to be focused with all these people, and Elizabeth and Darcy, and then the broader social things. But the series goes a little further even, and none of this would probably be done in a movie version. You just wouldn't have the time. Mm-hmm. But to give you a nice little scene like that, it's a nice little touch in the first episode.
So have we met Charlotte yet? We haven't talked about it.
Yeah, she's at the Lucas Lodge or or whatnot. You get the first intro to her. You get the pragmatic conversation between her and Elizabeth.
Yeah.
But this is a good point to bring this up. Is the actress who plays Charlotte? I'm going to look up her name right now. Lucy Scott feels like would be a better fit for playing Jane. She's very attractive. She has a very warm
She's mild.
face. She's very mild. And I wonder if they flipped those two roles, if it would be a significant change or not. Because I don't know. It's all subjective, of course, but I think that I don't know. Just her manner and caring of Charlotte isn't how I necessarily picture Charlotte. More so, that's how I picture Jane. But you get your first look at her just in that one brief scene. I think that's all she's in this episode, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then the episode finishes with Jane and Elizabeth leaving the Bingleys after the 3 sick days, long after the initial social, and they've kind of outstayed their welcome with the Bingleys. And definitely when Mrs. Bennet comes to kind of get her sense of things, you do feel that they've overstepped their bounds socially on the Bingleys and kind of embarrassed themselves.
My favorite on that scene is, and I put this out to Kurt as well, is when Miss Bennet comes into the room with her daughters. I say, watch Mr. Hurst, because as soon as he hears that she's coming, he goes as quickly as he can to the door to try and sneak out, but they make it in.
Nice.
They make it in, and then a little while later, you hear the door open, and the door shuts, and he's gone.
And he's out of the frame.
He's gone.
Oh, delightful.
He just walks right out. He's like, I'm not having this.
See, that would be lost in the pan and scan version.
Yeah.
This is one of those moments where I didn't notice that when I was watching.
You see him heading toward the door, and you don't actually see him. Well, you might actually see him leaving, but you hear the door close.
Oh, okay, so you get audio cue. That's good.
No,
That's good. But would you get those, if it was cropped, would you get the visual cue to set up that joke?
Well, yeah.
Um,
But then, and Kitty and Lydia, we haven't talked too much about them yet.
well, I think in this opening episode, you get the fact that they're giggly
Yeah.
and they're boorish at the
Two of the
initial
silliest
social things. I know, again, in the book, someone mentions that they're too young to even be out in society.
Mhm.
They don't do it. What I love about Pride and Prejudice, the miniseries, is it doesn't need a lot of the dialogue of Jane Austen rigorously saying something. Like, they can just show it. Like, there's a very good show don't tell ethos in this series, which is very atypical for TV, particularly in the 80s and 90s when television was just big pointy arrows and characters going over things to make sure the back of the room got it. I feel Pride and Prejudice, it does it with reaction shots, but that's good. That's what the visual medium is for, and it's very good at
Well,
it.
and I think that's how you really get to learn about Mr. Hurst, because in some of the shots, he's tapping on his wine glass, falling asleep.
Yes, yeah.
Come on, we're not playing cards, and a lot of that stuff is just seen as opposed to called out. I think there's only a couple lines.
Yeah, he's barely, he's there.
Not a character.
If you want to see, it's all there, but you don't have to look at him if you don't want to. So you get to be kind of when it's in the society scenes, you do get to be a little bit of a survey the party guest as much as following.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good act.
But I like how the sisters, particularly, and how they're picking on all of the people in the country and all their country manners, and pointing out all the negative things about all of these people in Meryton. But they never comment anything on Mr. Hurst and how he's snoring,
boorish,
he's damn tedious. It's very funny how they're not going to say anything about him, obviously, but
Well, he's not a threat either.
yeah, I suppose. Yeah, very good point. Very good point. Yeah.
I mean, the scene you brought up a little while ago of when Caroline and Elizabeth kind of present themselves walking to the fireplace for Darcy. It's such a great scene. I love the dancing scenes too, because there's so much going on outside the dance. But that scene, you can kind of chart out everyone's intention there, or at least Caroline's intention, where she simultaneously is trying to present herself for Darcy.
Yes.
Yes.
Have him, seek her out and say, look at me compared to this plain country girl or this country bumpkin.
Yeah.
And then on, the level above that is Elizabeth, who I think kind of clearly knows what Caroline's doing and sees through her, but also I think has a little bit of interest in Darcy and or at least likes getting a rise out of him. And then on the top level is kind of Darcy, simply because he never unveils his thoughts or his character, and he is clearly more in Elizabeth's camp for that scene too. But I mean, just so much of that going on with so few lines and just a few movements is really, really well done.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's Colin Firth's principal strength as an actor, is that you're saying that you're not getting Darcy's thoughts, or he's being close to the best. I feel Firth he doesn't do a lot, but he's giving massive amounts of information with very little. I get a lot of, this is what Darcy feels, or this is what Darcy thinks, just from looking at the way Firth's body language or his expression plays. What is most surprising about the whole fireplace chat with Carolyn Bingley is that I don't think Bingley realizes that it's not working. Like, she's making her play.
She has no idea.
And Darcy's like totally standing up for, well, I'm fine with that. Like, he's saying things that are shouting to the rafters that, enough of that bullshit, I like this. And it's kind of ironic that Carolyn Bingley doesn't, she's supposed to be the I've moved in bigger, more subtle social circles. And nothing here is subtle. This is all, I feel, right out on the table, and she doesn't see it. Or if she does see it,
maybe they're not taught to
maybe
really pay attention. It's here's the rules of society, as opposed to in this scene in particular, Elizabeth. Well, we already know she doesn't particularly care. She'll be polite, but she's not necessarily following to snare a man. But yeah,
I feel in Pride and Prejudice, and like you said, probably a lot of literature in this era, there's a measure of class, and then there's a measure of power, meaning like, women are kept here and men are here. But then there is, most importantly, which is what Pride and Prejudice is always chewing on, is the measure of character. Where is your, like, and that is valued the least on the surface, but to us as a viewing dramatic audience and inside of you rooting for these two to get together, their character is it's not only the most complex, but it also feels the most rise above it. And even when Darcy is, as he says, like, pride is fine if you know. So not big on modesty, but that's but the idea that he is of good character, so he can let loose a little bit on the social. That's I feel where he is. It's the idea, like, if you just get rich, you got to throw money around. But if you're really rich, you actually are quite understated, and that's the way he is with class conventions. If you were just rich, you would be like, everything is proper, and you follow to show that you can play in that class. But if you're super comfortable, then you can be a dick sometimes if you don't like your company. Like, and that's that's kind of Caroline too. Like, that she is in a comfortable station, and I think there's also the expectation that she's always assumed that she's going to marry Darcy because she and her brother have been friends for a long time. They talk about Darcy's sister as a potential for Bingley, and everyone likes to keep these things nice and incestuous. And in turn, that probably is what makes Darcy so uninterested in Carolyn, is that she has this expectation or assumption that she's already won him. So there's no challenge to that. That there's nothing interesting about this person who really has no character other than something that she's essentially thought she's been given her entire life.
That fireside, that's one of the first scenes that you see Darcy joking or teasing with both Elizabeth and Caroline. The whole, well, if I walk with you, then that's defeating the purpose. And that's the first time, it's almost the first flirt, I'd say, during that. Because any conversation before that's a lot more rigid and a lot less jokey let's say, whereas that one's his first time he's opening it up, say, well, I can best see your figure from here, right? And that.
Oh, the tour around the room. Yeah, and I think they try to prime you the fact that Darcy is the closer Darcy is to his station, the more comfortable and relaxed that he's going to be, and he seems to be on edge, or just doesn't want to be at this. Like, it's almost like he's dragged by Bingley. Hey, I bought this house. It's in the country. Yeah, no one's politically at this level, but it'll be fun. The girls are good looking. Let's just go. And he's like, yeah, I don't like society at the best of times. Now you want to make me deal with all these, suitors just lining up. And so when he's back at the Bingley thing, and it's just the sisters, and they're just in the drawing room, and it's quiet, and there's no things he will let his guard down and show that hey, I can be fun too.
Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily just the whole in his class society, but the idea that he is building he already has a little bit of a friendship, obviously, with the Bingleys, but now Elizabeth's been a little more introduced, so he's getting to know her as well. So I think he's getting more comfortable as well with people that he knows.
Well, I think I get the sense that he watches over Bingley too, and obviously, we find out later some of the efforts that he goes to for his friend, but you get the sense that, like, his family and his father in turn take it upon themselves to help out, I guess, close acquaintances or friends of the family, and kind of look after or tend to them. And I could easily see him, Bingley saying, hey, I'm going to buy this property in the country, and Darcy just saying, oh, great, you're going to fall in love with some bumpkin, you're going to rush into a marriage that you're not equipped for, you're not, without thinking about it. I could easily see him that, or at least that be an explanation for Darcy following him to the country.
Mm.
But man, Mr. Bingley, he's a fun guy at parties. He's the life of the party. He's dancing with everybody. He's all smiles, and he's genuine about it.
Yes,
there's something unassuming about
but
about
naive
Bingley,
too.
What's that?
But naive too.
I suppose. I suppose they often arm in arm. I don't know. Is there any bits and bobs left over from this episode? Things that struck out, or that we didn't talk about over the course of this intro?
Oh, my favorite line there. Mrs. Bennet, nothing you do will ever vex me again. And Mr. Bennet, I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah. Oh, well, in terms of Mr. Bennett Zinger's, description of all the dresses and whatever.
No lace.
No lace. I get the Brad Bird no capes in The Incredibles. He's like, let us I have no interest in any of this. And the sort of joyous obliviousness of Mrs. Bennet, that Mr. she should know after this many years of marriage. And his only defense is, like you said, oh, now my little barbs aren't going to bother you? This is a shame, right? So, yeah, everything Mr. Bennet says is gold. I could watch... if this series were about Mr. Bennet, I would be fine with that. I love that character. I love the actor playing him.
This is the idea for the next BBC sitcom is British Dad 19th Century, and it's all in the family. Basically, Mr. Bennet sitting in his chair.
With the Bennets. Oh, that would be that's a major missed opportunity. Is what that is.
Well, I think that about wraps it up for episode 1, which I think conveniently is called episode 1 in the series. And next we'll be introduced to someone who may even give Mrs. Bennet a run for their money, and just how over the top and obsequious they can be. So stay tuned for that.